Most people think the biggest mistakes in business happen in boardrooms. They don't. Sometimes they happen when someone decides a thing is worthless and walks away without looking back. The black sedan arrived at Walker Automotive on a rainy Thursday morning just after 8 a.m. It rolled off the flatbed slowly, water dripping from the wheel wells and running down the faded paint. The driver handed over a clipboard, collected a signature, and left without saying much. Ethan Walker stood beneath the service bay awning with a coffee growing cold in his hand and watched the car settle onto the concrete. Something about it felt unusual, though he couldn't have explained why. The vehicle wasn't exotic. It wasn't rare. It wasn't even particularly attractive. It looked like the kind of executive car that spent years moving between office buildings, airport terminals, and corporate parking garages. Reliable. Expensive. Forgettable. The paperwork attached to the windshield carried a name that most people in the city would have recognized immediately. Claire Bennett. CEO of Bennett Dynamics. 43,000 employees. Offices in 12 states. Annual revenue measured in billions. Ethan read the name once, folded the document, and slid it into his work shirt pocket. Then he got back to work. He had never cared much about titles. At 38 years old, Ethan had learned that engines rarely cared who owned them. They broke all the same. Across the shop floor, an air compressor rattled to life. A customer argued about a repair estimate near the front counter. The smell of oil and metal drifted through the building like it always did. Normal sounds. Normal problems. The kind of life Ethan preferred. By noon, his 7-year-old daughter Lily was sitting at the small desk near the office window, finishing homework while waiting for school pickup traffic to clear. She wore a blue sweatshirt 2 sizes too large and had a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. Every few minutes she looked up to find her father somewhere in the garage. Every time she found him, she smiled and returned to her workbook. Ethan smiled back once before turning his attention to the sedan. The repair request was unusually short. Vehicle not worth repairing. Owner declined further service. Dispose if necessary. He read the sentence twice. Most people sold old cars. Some donated them. Wealthy people traded them in without a second thought. But something about the wording bothered him. Dispose if necessary. It sounded less like a business decision and more like someone trying to forget. Late that afternoon the rain intensified. Water tapped against the shop windows while the rest of the crew headed home. Ethan stayed behind to finish paperwork. The sedan remained parked in Bay 3 beneath a single overhead light. For several minutes he found himself looking at it without knowing why. Finally he set down his pen and walked across the garage. He opened the driver's door. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cedar. Clean. Meticulously maintained. Nothing unusual. Then he noticed something. Wedged deep between the center console and the driver's seat was a small brass key attached to a faded red tag. The tag had been worn smooth by time. There were no numbers. No labels. Just 3 handwritten words that had nearly disappeared beneath years of wear. Ethan leaned closer. The words were still barely visible beneath the fading ink. For a long moment he stared at them without moving. Then he quietly read them aloud. For Claire. When ready. The garage was quiet by the time Ethan locked the front office and switched off the neon sign facing the highway. Rain continued to fall outside in a steady rhythm, tapping against the metal roof above Bay 3. The sedan remained exactly where it had been all day, sitting beneath the overhead light as though it had been waiting for someone to notice it. Ethan turned the faded red tag over in his hand once more. For Claire. When ready. The handwriting looked old. Not months old. Years old. The ink had faded naturally, worn down by time rather than weather. Whoever had written it had expected the key to remain hidden for a very long time. He slipped the tag into his pocket and looked around the interior again. Everything appeared ordinary. The glove compartment contained registration papers. The center console held a charging cable and a few receipts. The trunk was empty except for a roadside emergency kit that had never been opened. Nothing matched the mystery of the key. Behind him, a small voice broke the silence. "Did you find treasure?" Lily stood near the office doorway holding her stuffed rabbit beneath one arm. Ethan smiled slightly. "I am not sure yet." Lily walked closer and looked into the car with serious concentration. "Grandpa used to hide things in books," she said. "Maybe somebody hid something in there too." Ethan glanced toward her. Children often noticed connections adults ignored. "Maybe," he said. Lily nodded as if the matter had been settled. 10 minutes later they were driving home through wet streets illuminated by yellow traffic lights reflected in puddles. The key remained in Ethan's jacket pocket. He found himself thinking about it at every stoplight. By the time they reached their apartment, he had already decided he would take a closer look in the morning. Across town, 26 floors above downtown traffic, Claire Bennett sat alone inside a conference room overlooking the city skyline. A financial presentation glowed on the wall display. Red numbers dominated the screen. 3 board members had left less than an hour earlier. 2 major contracts were stalled. Investors wanted answers she did not yet have. The abandoned sedan never crossed her mind. She had not driven it in nearly 4 years. It had belonged to her father before his death. Afterward it had been parked, moved, stored, and eventually forgotten among larger problems. To Claire it represented a chapter of life she rarely allowed herself to revisit. The following morning Ethan arrived at the shop before sunrise. The air smelled of rain and motor oil. He poured coffee into a paper cup and walked directly toward Bay 3. This time he noticed something he had missed before. The driver's seat showed years of use, but the passenger seat looked almost untouched. The difference was subtle. Most people would never have seen it. Ethan leaned inside and studied the dashboard carefully. Then his eyes stopped on a narrow section of wood trim running beneath the passenger side air vent. A faint scratch interrupted the grain pattern. It was barely visible. Deliberate. Not damage. A mark. The kind someone leaves behind so they can find the same spot again years later. Ethan set down his coffee. For the first time since the sedan arrived, he felt certain of one thing. The key belonged somewhere inside the car. And someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure only the right person would ever find it. Ethan spent the next 20 minutes examining the section of wood trim without touching it. Experience had taught him that forcing a mystery usually destroyed the answer. Instead he studied the details. The scratch was not random. It formed a short diagonal mark no longer than half an inch, positioned exactly where a driver's hand would never naturally reach. Someone had placed it there intentionally. He retrieved the brass key from his pocket and turned it over beneath the fluorescent lights. The metal was old but carefully maintained. No corrosion. No damage. Whoever owned it had expected it to be used eventually. Just not soon. The rest of the crew began arriving shortly after 7. Air tools started humming. Radios came alive. Customers appeared at the front counter with ordinary problems that needed ordinary solutions. Ethan handled them all, but part of his attention remained fixed on the sedan. Around lunchtime, when the bays briefly emptied, he returned to the vehicle. This time he pressed lightly against the wood panel near the scratch. Nothing happened. He tried again farther down the trim. Still nothing. Then he noticed something unusual. The sound changed. Most of the dashboard produced a solid response when tapped. One small section sounded hollow. Ethan froze. He tapped again. Hollow. He leaned closer and followed the grain pattern carefully. The seam was almost invisible. Whoever designed it had intended it to disappear completely. He inserted the brass key into a narrow opening concealed beneath the trim. For a second nothing happened. Then a soft mechanical click echoed inside the dashboard. A compartment no larger than a hardcover book slid forward less than an inch. Ethan stared at it silently. Modern vehicles did not contain hidden compartments like this. At least not factory-built ones. Someone had commissioned it. Someone with money. Someone with a reason. Slowly he opened it. Inside rested a single black leather case. No documents. No cash. No jewelry. Just a worn leather case with a silver clasp. Ethan removed it carefully and set it on the passenger seat. His pulse remained steady, but curiosity settled heavily across his shoulders. The case looked old enough to have spent years hidden inside the dashboard. He opened the clasp. Inside was a small digital recorder and a folded envelope. Nothing else. The envelope carried a handwritten message. Ethan recognized the same handwriting from the faded red tag. For Claire. Open only when you are ready to hear the truth. For several seconds he simply looked at the words. The garage noises faded into the background. Whoever had written the note had not expected anyone else to find it. This had never been intended for a mechanic. Or a repair shop. Or a stranger. It was a message waiting for a daughter. Across town, Claire Bennett stood before another difficult board meeting. Questions came from every direction. Revenue projections. Investor pressure. Delayed contracts. She answered calmly, but exhaustion showed in the spaces between her sentences. Her father's name appeared briefly during the discussion when one board member referenced an old strategic decision he had made years earlier. Claire immediately moved the conversation forward. Nobody noticed. Yet for the rest of the meeting she seemed distracted. Back at the shop, Ethan carefully returned the recorder and envelope to the leather case. He did not open either one. Some things belonged to their owners. But as he closed the compartment, he noticed one final detail hidden beneath the case. A narrow sheet of paper had been taped to the bottom. On it was a date written in black ink. October 14th. 8 years ago. The exact day Richard Bennett had died. That evening Ethan could not stop thinking about the date. 8 years earlier. The same day Richard Bennett had died. He sat at the small kitchen table while lily-colored pictures beside him. Rain tapped softly against the apartment window. The leather case rested unopened near his coffee mug. Lily glanced up from her crayons. "Is that the mystery thing?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Something like that." She studied the case for a moment. If somebody hid it, maybe they were afraid nobody would listen. Ethan looked at her. Children had a way of arriving at truths without taking the long road adults preferred. He smiled faintly and returned his attention to the envelope. For Claire. Open only when you are ready to hear the truth. The words felt less like instructions and more like a warning. The next morning brought unexpected news. Bennett Dynamics appeared across every business channel in the waiting room television. A major acquisition was reportedly days away from collapsing. Analysts questioned leadership decisions. Investors demanded answers. Reporters gathered outside company headquarters. Ethan watched the coverage while filling out repair orders. On the screen, Claire Bennett walked through a crowd of cameras wearing a dark coat and a controlled expression. She answered no questions. Yet for a brief second she looked exhausted. Not weak. Not defeated. Simply tired. Ethan switched off the television. Whatever problems existed inside Bennett Dynamics were not his business. Still, the leather case remained in his office drawer. Around noon he made a decision. He called the number listed on the original repair paperwork. After 3 transfers and nearly 10 minutes on hold, a professional voice answered. Office of Claire Bennett. Ethan introduced himself and explained that something had been discovered inside the vehicle. Silence followed. Then the assistant asked him to repeat himself. He did. Another pause. Mr. Walker, the vehicle was scheduled for disposal. Any personal items should be forwarded through legal review. Ethan glanced toward the office drawer. I think this is different. The assistant's tone became more cautious. How different? Ethan looked through the glass toward the sedan sitting quietly in Bay 3. Different enough that I do not think it should go through legal review first. The line remained silent for several seconds. Finally the assistant promised to pass along the message. The call ended. Ethan expected nothing to happen. Yet less than 2 hours later a black SUV pulled into the repair shop parking lot. 2 people stepped out. One was a sharply dressed attorney carrying a leather briefcase. The other was an older man in his late 60s with silver hair and tired eyes. He introduced himself as Thomas Reed, former personal advisor to Richard Bennett. The moment Ethan mentioned the hidden compartment, the color drained from the older man's face. For several seconds he simply stared. Then he asked a question that immediately changed everything. Tell me honestly, Thomas said quietly. Did you find the recorder too? Ethan did not answer right away. The old man's reaction had already revealed something important. He knew exactly what was hidden inside the car. More importantly, he had been expecting it to surface someday. Thomas lowered himself into a chair and exhaled slowly. Richard spent the last year of his life trying to leave a message behind, he said. The problem was that nobody ever found it. We eventually assumed he changed his mind. Ethan looked toward the office drawer again. Thomas followed his gaze. Neither man spoke for a moment. Then the older man said something that made Ethan's pulse slow almost to a stop. If that recorder is what I think it is, there is a very good chance Claire's entire company was built on a lie. Thomas Reed sat quietly for several seconds after speaking. Outside the office window, customers came and went as though nothing unusual was happening. A pickup truck pulled into the lot. Someone dropped off keys at the front counter. An air wrench echoed from the service bay. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet inside the small office, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Ethan leaned back in his chair. A lie? He asked. Thomas nodded slowly. Richard Bennett was one of the most careful men I have ever known. If he went to the trouble of hiding a recorder inside a custom compartment, he believed whatever was on it would matter years later. The attorney beside him remained silent, but his expression confirmed the concern. Ethan opened the drawer and removed the leather case. Both visitors immediately focused on it. Thomas looked older than he had 10 minutes earlier. I have not opened any of it, Ethan said. It belongs to Claire. Thomas exhaled. That may be true. But if Richard left what I think he left, time matters now. Across the city, time was becoming a luxury Claire Bennett no longer possessed. The acquisition deal that had dominated headlines all week was unraveling faster than anyone expected. 3 institutional investors had delayed approval. Analysts questioned projected earnings. Financial reporters spent entire segments debating whether Bennett Dynamics had expanded too aggressively. Claire sat at the head of a conference table reviewing forecasts that seemed to worsen every hour. Her assistant entered carrying a tablet. There is something else, she said carefully. Claire rubbed her eyes. Please tell me it is good news. A repair shop called again. Claire looked up. The car? Her assistant nodded. They claim they found something that belonged to your father. For the first time all day, Claire stopped thinking about contracts and numbers. Richard Bennett had been gone 8 years. Most reminders of him existed in photographs, archived interviews, and framed awards hanging in hallways nobody noticed anymore. The old sedan was one of the few personal possessions she had never managed to part with. Not because she loved it. Because she never found the energy to decide what to do with it. What exactly did they find? Claire asked. They would not say over the phone. Meanwhile, Ethan watched Thomas carefully inspect the outside of the leather case. The older man traced a finger across the silver clasp. "I remember this," he said quietly. "Richard carried it everywhere during the final months." Ethan remained silent. Thomas continued. The board believed he was preparing transition documents. Legal instructions. Succession planning. Nobody imagined he was hiding something. The attorney finally spoke. "Do you understand what happens if this recorder contains information affecting corporate ownership?" Ethan shook his head. "I fix engines." The attorney almost smiled. "Then consider yourself fortunate." Thomas looked toward the sedan through the office window. Richard used to say machines were honest. People were the complicated part. Before Ethan could respond, the office phone rang. He answered it. A calm female voice introduced herself. "Claire Bennett." For a brief moment nobody spoke. Then Claire asked a simple question. "Mr. Walker, is it true that you found something inside my father's car?" Ethan looked at the leather case resting between them. "Yes," he said. "And I think you should see it yourself." Claire arrived just before sunset. There was no press convoy. No executive motorcade. Just a dark SUV pulling quietly into the repair shop parking lot. Ethan was finishing a brake inspection when he noticed the vehicle through the open bay door. He wiped his hands on a shop towel and watched her step out. She looked different from the woman on television. Shorter than he expected. More tired. The confidence remained, but it seemed weighed down by something heavier than business pressure. Claire entered the office accompanied only by her assistant. Thomas Reed stood when he saw her. For a brief second neither spoke. Then Claire hugged the older man lightly. "You should have called me," she said. Thomas smiled sadly. "I was not sure what we had found." Ethan retrieved the leather case from the office drawer and placed it on the desk. The room became very quiet. Claire stared at it immediately. Something in her expression changed. Recognition. "I remember this," she said softly. "My father carried it everywhere during his last year." She reached toward it but stopped before touching it. "I thought it disappeared after the funeral." Thomas exchanged a glance with the attorney. Nobody interrupted. Finally Claire opened the clasp. Inside rested the recorder and the envelope exactly where Ethan had left them. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the note. 8 years of unanswered questions suddenly sat in her hands. She read the handwriting and looked away for a moment. Ethan noticed her eyes glisten briefly before she regained control. "This is his writing," she said. Without question. Slowly she opened the envelope. A folded letter slid onto the desk. The first page contained only one sentence. "If you are reading this, then somebody finally looked closely enough to find what everyone else missed." Ethan felt Thomas shift beside him. Claire continued reading silently. Her expression changed line by line. Confusion first. Then surprise. Then concern. Halfway through the second page she stopped completely. "That is impossible," she whispered. Thomas leaned forward. "What does it say?" Claire looked up. "He wrote this 3 weeks before he died." She swallowed. He believed someone inside the company was manipulating financial reports. The attorney immediately sat straighter. Claire continued reading. Richard Bennett had documented irregular transactions, hidden liabilities, and internal transfers that never appeared in official records. According to the letter, he had begun a private investigation before his death. But the most shocking part came near the end. Claire read it twice to make sure she understood correctly. Then she lowered the paper slowly. "My father did not finish the investigation," she said. "He says the evidence is on the recorder." Nobody spoke. Outside, the sounds of the repair shop had faded. Most employees had already gone home. Even the traffic beyond the highway seemed distant. The entire room focused on the small device resting inside the leather case. 8 years earlier, Richard Bennett had hidden a message because he feared the wrong people would find it first. Now that message had finally resurfaced. Claire stared at the recorder for a long moment before reaching for it. Then she froze. Something else was inside the case. Tucked beneath the recorder was a second folded note that none of them had noticed before. On the front, written in the same careful handwriting, were 6 words that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. "Do not play this alone." Nobody moved for several seconds. The small note sat on the desk beside the recorder, turning a moment of curiosity into something far more serious. Claire read the 6 words again. "Do not play this alone." Thomas Reed slowly lowered himself into a chair. The color had faded from his face. "That sounds exactly like Richard," he said quietly. If he believed something was important, he never exaggerated. Which means whatever is on that recorder frightened him. Claire looked at the device resting inside the leather case. For 8 years it had remained hidden less than 10 miles from her office, sealed inside a car she could never quite bring herself to sell. The thought seemed to unsettle her more than anything written in the letter. Ethan remained standing near the desk. He had repaired thousands of vehicles over the years. He had discovered lost wallets, forgotten jewelry, old photographs, even cash hidden beneath seats. Nothing had ever led to a room full of executives, lawyers, and secrets buried for nearly a decade. Claire finally picked up the recorder. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. The battery compartment had been modified with an external power connector. Thomas immediately noticed. "Richard did that himself," he said. "He was convinced batteries fail but evidence should not." Claire gave a faint smile. It was the first sign of warmth anyone had seen from her since arriving. "That sounds like him." The attorney connected the recorder to a portable power bank from his briefcase. A small indicator light flickered to life. The device still worked. 8 years hidden inside a dashboard and it still worked. Nobody spoke. Outside, evening settled across the repair shop parking lot. The service bays stood quiet. Most employees had gone home. Through the office window Ethan could see Lily sitting at the front counter drawing pictures beside her stuffed rabbit. Every few minutes she looked toward the office, checking that her father was still there. Ethan waved once. She smiled and returned to her coloring book. The normalcy of the moment felt strangely comforting. Inside the office, Claire pressed the play button. Static filled the speaker for several seconds. Then a familiar voice emerged. Older. Calm. Unmistakable. Richard Bennett. Claire immediately covered her mouth with one hand. 8 years disappeared in an instant. "If you are hearing this," Richard said, "then somebody finally found the place I hoped nobody else would." His voice carried the steady confidence of a man accustomed to difficult decisions. "Claire, if you are listening, there are things I should have told you long ago." Nobody interrupted. Richard continued. He spoke about the company. About responsibility. About trust. For nearly 3 minutes nothing sounded alarming. Then his tone changed. "I discovered evidence that someone inside Bennett Dynamics has been moving assets through a parallel reporting structure. The numbers presented to the board are not the same numbers appearing in internal audits." Claire exchanged a glance with Thomas. The older man looked stunned. Richard continued speaking. "I cannot prove the full scope yet. But I have identified the individual responsible. The room became completely silent. Even the hum of the office refrigerator seemed loud. Claire leaned closer. Thomas gripped the edge of the desk. The attorney stopped taking notes. After 8 years, they were finally about to learn the name Richard Bennett had died trying to uncover. Then the recording crackled. Static burst through the speaker. The audio distorted heavily for several seconds. Richard's voice returned briefly. One sentence emerged clearly before the signal failed again. The person responsible is someone you already trust. The final sentence hung in the room long after the recorder fell silent. The person responsible is someone you already trust. Claire stared at the device as though it might suddenly continue speaking. Thomas Reed slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The attorney looked down at his notes, then back at the recorder, searching for a detail everyone else might have missed. Nobody found one. Richard Bennett had identified a culprit. He had recorded the truth. And somehow the most important name had vanished behind 8 years of static. Claire finally broke the silence. Can it be repaired? The attorney carefully picked up the recorder. Possibly. The audio corruption sounds localized. If the original file remains intact, a specialist may be able to recover portions of it. Thomas shook his head. Richard would have anticipated that risk. He reached for the letter and turned several pages over. His eyes narrowed. Then he stopped. Wait. Everyone looked at him. Richard always created redundancy. Claire frowned. What do you mean? Thomas pointed toward the final page of the letter. A paragraph near the bottom had seemed insignificant earlier. Now it carried a different meaning. Richard had written a single sentence beneath his signature. If the recording fails, follow the numbers. Ethan watched Claire read the line twice. What numbers? She asked. Thomas looked around the office. That is exactly the question Richard wanted someone to ask. For the next hour they examined every item recovered from the compartment. The envelope. The recorder. The leather case. Even the hidden compartment itself. Nothing revealed an obvious answer. Outside, darkness settled across the parking lot. Lily eventually fell asleep on a chair near the front counter with her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her arm. Ethan draped a blanket over her shoulders before returning to the office. When he walked back in, Claire was holding the leather case beneath the desk lamp. Look at this, she said quietly. Ethan stepped closer. Along the inside edge of the leather lining were tiny embossed markings. Not decorative patterns. Numbers. Hundreds of them. Organized into narrow columns no wider than a pencil line. Thomas immediately leaned forward. Those are account references. Claire looked up sharply. You recognize them? Not individually, Thomas said. But Richard used similar indexing systems when he reviewed financial structures. The attorney began photographing every sequence. The deeper they looked, the stranger the pattern became. Some numbers repeated. Others appeared only once. Several matched years. Others matched internal division codes used by Bennett Dynamics. Claire's expression changed from curiosity to concern. These are not random. Thomas nodded. No. This is a map. Across the city, lights still glowed on the upper floors of Bennett Dynamics headquarters. Executives worked late preparing reports for investors. Market analysts debated the company's future. Board members exchanged confidential emails. None of them knew that a mechanics repair shop now contained information hidden by the company's founder 8 years earlier. Back in the office, the attorney finished comparing one sequence against public filings available online. He froze. Then he slowly turned the screen toward Claire. You need to see this. Claire studied the document. Her face immediately lost color. Ethan could not see the details, but he recognized the reaction. It was the look people had when a puzzle suddenly became something real. Claire looked up. "This account number is active." Thomas blinked. "That is impossible." Claire shook her head. "Not only active. It processed transactions last month." The room fell silent again. Richard Bennett had died 8 years ago. Yet whatever trail he had hidden inside the car was still moving money today. The discovery changed everything within 48 hours. What began inside a forgotten dashboard became the center of an internal review that reached the highest levels of Bennett dynamics. The account references hidden inside the leather case led investigators through a chain of transactions stretching back nearly a decade. The numbers did not reveal stolen money. They revealed something stranger. Entire assets had been quietly moved into protected holding structures Richard Bennett himself had created before his death. The purpose was not concealment for personal gain. It was protection. Richard had anticipated a financial crisis that never appeared publicly because he had spent his final months building safeguards nobody knew existed. The person he had suspected was not a criminal. It was a senior executive he once trusted who had been making increasingly aggressive decisions that threatened the long-term stability of the company. Richard had feared those decisions would eventually place everything at risk. The hidden structures were his contingency plan. The recovered records proved it. The board spent 3 days reviewing documents. Independent auditors verified the accounts. Legal teams confirmed ownership. By the end of the week, billions of dollars in protected assets that nobody fully understood were brought back into the company's financial picture. Investor panic disappeared almost overnight. Projects scheduled for cancellation survived. Contracts that seemed lost returned. For the first time in months, Bennett Dynamics stopped reacting to problems and started moving forward again. Claire sat alone in her office late Friday evening looking through the final pages of her father's letter. The city lights stretched beyond the glass walls. For years she had believed his last gift was the company itself. Now she understood that he had left something far more valuable. Trust. A roadmap. And a reminder that leadership was not about appearing certain. It was about paying attention when something felt wrong. Her assistant entered quietly and placed a folder on the desk. "The board approved everything this afternoon," she said. Claire nodded. Then she asked a question that surprised her assistant. "What happened to the repair shop invoice?" The following Saturday morning a familiar sedan rolled into Walker Automotive once again. This time Claire was behind the wheel. The engine ran smoothly. The paint still showed its age. Nothing about the car looked extraordinary. Ethan was replacing brake pads on a pickup truck when she arrived. He finished the job before walking over. Claire stepped out and looked at the vehicle for a long moment. "My father loved this car," she said. Ethan nodded. "I can see why." For several seconds neither spoke. Then Claire handed him an envelope. Inside was a check large enough to change most people's lives. Ethan looked at it once and handed it back. "You do not owe me anything." Claire smiled. "That is exactly what Thomas said you would say." She replaced the check with a smaller envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for looking closely enough to see what everyone else missed. Richard Bennett." Ethan stared at the signature. Then he folded the note and placed it carefully in his pocket. From the front office, Lily walked outside carrying her stuffed rabbit. She looked at the old sedan and then at Claire. "Is that the mystery car?" she asked. Claire laughed softly. "I think it always will be." Lily nodded seriously. "My dad finds things other people miss." Claire looked at Ethan for a moment before turning back toward the car. "Yes," she said quietly. "I know.